One of the things that we last left with, Gabe, was the idea of, first of all, this sort of idea that if something that's possible is being thought of as impossible or absolutely the last thing you want to have happen, so there's a fight against the possibility, it tends to magnify on the other side. Like you're trying to minimize one thing, it tends to magnify the sense of doom in respect to all other things, right? Moving from one instance of a phone call that triggers an idea about something that may be wrong, and all of a sudden everything seems to be potentially shaded or colored with that um, idea. And one of the hallmarks of this discussion is that if I can, there's two ways we see visibly and we see through understanding. And if my understanding is seeing things that don't exist as reality, then the subsequent understanding I have is misunderstanding and reactive at the same time because I'm fighting to maintain an idea that isn't true. And the only way to do that is to constantly maintain it, which is a struggle because it's impossible to maintain it all the time. It's impossible to maintain it forever because it has no basis other than thinking about thinking it's true. Right. So that conflict is there. So the blindness, which I often hear people talk about when they were drinking. I certainly did it. I said, I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know. I couldn't see. I couldn't see. I couldn't see. Well, the blindness was in the understanding because I had taken on this conflicted thought and made believe it was true. All of a sudden, I acted as though, because my misunderstanding became my understanding, I acted as though I couldn't see it. And I suspect that is no different than what we do once we're sober, because once we're sober, we don't have the chemical alteration in our system, but we can still alter the chemicals of our system by creating emergencies that aren't really emergencies, except to the thinking we're doing about the absolute necessity of defending the thought we're maintaining that isn't true. And so it seems, at least seems to me in my experience, when I do that I don't see what I'm doing and I don't think I'm doing what I'm doing. And as a result of thinking I'm not doing what I'm doing, I must not be doing what I'm doing. And then I keep searching and looking for all sorts of other reasons and excuses to finally fix this problem rather than notice I'm creating it in the thought I'm having about something. It doesn't have to be, I don't even have to know what the thought is to know that if I am facing that seeming impossibility of constantly trying to manage things and fix things and feel better about things, that I'm obviously maintaining an idea that isn't better and can't be fixed. Rather than think of it as something out there, begin to notice that the magnification of including everything out there as a possible solution is the denial of the simplicity of the single thought I'm having that is wrong being thought to be right.
You mentioned the word necessity or necessary,
Yeah.
a necessary thought.
Well, it seems that way.
We feel it's necessary.
Yeah. Well, to maintain the delusion, yes, it is. I mean, if insanity is only insanity as long as we think it's sane, and historically, if somebody says, look, I'm insane, the psychological or psychiatric opinion would be, well, you're not so insane as to not notice you're insane. So that really wouldn't qualify you in the ultimate sense of insanity because the insane person thinks they're perfectly sane. And this is the exact same base root of the idea that a lie can be true. So that necessity is the addiction. That necessity is the chronic defensiveness, the chronic reactiveness, the chronic impulsiveness, the chronic compulsiveness to make believe the only thing we can do is try to escape while we're trying to manage something that doesn't even exist. And that's the unmanageability of the first step, is that we're really looking at a thought that has no basis. I can control and enjoy my drinking. I can control and enjoy my drugs. I can control and enjoy anything I'm entertaining as fantasy when it has no basis in reality. So the only enjoyment I get out of it is the adrenaline release, the short-term release of this bodily emergency I've created, and it seems to give me some benefit, but it gives me also this long-term sense of doom and pain because I know what's coming. I know that failure is coming while I'm insisting on being righteous about the decisions I make, because it's all born in that at that point in fear. Why? I wouldn't be afraid if I didn't know something was wrong. I would feel successful at the failure I was accomplishing or attempting to pretend I could accomplish.
Yeah, a lot of successful people talk about failure as you know, the touchstone to growth and experience, and like they want to fail or don't look at failure as most others do.
Yeah. Well, and the difference is that, the fact is that this thing we're doing that seems to be impossible is only impossible as long as we think we're not doing it. So the thing we're thinking about it, rather than saying, look, this is valuable information, what the life's terms are telling me about what I'm doing is that I'm not doing something that actually aligns with how things work in this universe. Right? If I'm Orville and Wilbur and I keep sending people up in an airplane that's bound to crash, at some point I would be culpable. I would say immediately, but I would be culpable for the damage I'm creating. I would be creating this life threatening situation and just saying, you guys go test it. I'm not going to change the way I think about it. I'm going to keep doing the same thing over and over again, thinking someday it'll get better the more and more people I put in the cockpit and try to get up into the air. And it's the same with the thinking, the idea that somehow it'll be right, and it has no place. So, how do we tend to feel? Disjointed, disconnected, displaced, have no place. What do we need? Always need to get somewhere else, someplace else with something else. Never here now in that thinking. While in fact, that's all just a delusional rationalization attempting to overcome the problem rather than concede the problem is being created by the thinking about something that is wrong as right. So the value in all that stuff, once noticed, is in fact, it's like our owner's manual for a new car or whatever. It's the curriculum that's giving us the information about how well we're doing with our thinking in relation to reality, rather than thinking of our thinking as reality, which undermines our ability to actually consider what's happening because we go into that blind state of misunderstanding, rather than say, oh, this is valuable information. I can use this. And the book says we become usefully whole. We start all of a sudden the obstacles, the mental obstacles, these aren't real obstacles for spirit or life or any of that stuff. They're just mental obstacles built on the basis of this misunderstanding, the blindness of that saying all that's happening is what I think and nothing else other than what I think is happening. That's a very great devaluation and depreciation of our functional capacity as beings to express that knowing nature through our physical body.
I get feelings of less than, like, why do other people, not about drinking, not about doing that, but that other people can go through life without this seeming obsession of thought and fear that we're talking about here.
Mhm.
Think that's the case, that they don't go through those things, or is that
No, I
the
think when
feelings
you
of
look at,
less than are accurate or somehow accurate?
I would say they're absolutely accurate. If you're trading in an absolute knowing source for only what you think is happening is real, that would be considerably less than that absolute knowing source,
Yeah, damn it.
right? So the accuracy of that is in fact accurate. But think of this, Gabe, to make believe that looking at people's surface is telling you what is going on inside of them is again relying on effect or appearance rather than substance.
Mhm.
So if truth is substantive, it's invisible, and yet it's indivisible. Its invisibility doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means we just can't see it, but how we know it is in its presence. We know in our present state when we're not preoccupied with conflicted thinking that there's an absolute state of presence that's very, very reassuring. And I would say that's the grace, that's the power of that absolute natural source. So if we're trading that in for nothing, certainly feeling less than and low self-esteem and depreciated and apart and alone would be natural, but it's only natural to the thinking we're doing, and it's accurate to the thinking we're doing, not who we are. Who I am is rooted in that absolute knowing. What I think is rooted in what I think.
Say that again. What I
So back to the if substance is the substance of everything we look at in terms of a form, like you see a body and you look at the form, you don't always see the substance. You might be able to sense it, but if the sensations we're having about our own experience are misunderstood, then we're going to misunderstand what we're sensing in others too, right?
right?
So one of the ways to do that is just think that how they look is all they are. Just as we think that our thinking defines reality, because it just happens to be what we're thinking. But if what we're thinking has no basis in reality, because it's just a thought, fantasy, acting as reality, that emptiness would be common to our experience. So, what are we going to see out there but the form? Rather than say, oh, well, the substance is invisible and it's indivisible, so I can't separate it in thought, and I can't be separate from it in thought, and neither can that other person I'm looking at. So if I'm honest about what I'm seeing, I'm starting to see that the form that is being projected that I see with my eyes is absolutely grounded per se in a reality that is the same reality that is the indivisible reality we all share. So I'm no longer looking at them as I don't think they're thinking what I'm thinking, so I should be thinking like that, meaning I should be completely devoid of any sensation. I'm actually arguing in favor of numbness and dumbness. I'm trying to dumb down my sensitivity, my sensational capacity to experience and be aware of awareness in a pure sense, not just in the things I see with my eyes, but in an understanding sense. And that knowingness, if I know, and what I know is that there's an absolute source, then I effectively know that for you too, and everyone else. I can't tell you that and have you believe that or agree with that, because ultimately we each get to think for ourselves, seemingly, and make decisions that may well be in conflict with that. But again, the conflict isn't being caused with reality or a sense of knowing. It's simply being it's simply being a conflict in thought about reality and knowing. You follow any better?
Yeah, just don't like the results.
What do you find the result to be?
No, like the I don't know, just the feelings of what are you talking about? That perception. Like we had a dinner party last night. We had 8 people over with their kids, big party. And the conversation seemed so sort of boring and like uninteresting. And I thought about is is that am I feeling those things because I'm used to these kind of conversations with sober people. And I was the only sober person there, but I don't know. It seemed I didn't seem in place or in connected or
Yeah,
feeling
well,
the less than, and I don't know. Like it seemed, what's the word? Like just unnecessary to talk about these things that they were talking about. Just normal conversation of a normal dinner party. It's like nothing was great, but it just seemed lame to me. It seemed like I wasn't supposed to be here.
well, it feels dull.
Dull, there is a good word.
Yeah, yeah, and but if you're accurately assessing something and it's dull, certainly that wouldn't describe inspiration or intuition or a sense of grace. It would describe a very rote form of operating, in my experience, which is largely what I see in the world. And this really crosses into something that I've been thinking about with you in my head, in my thoughts, sort of talking to my experience of you about this, how to sort of present this to you. And it's also part of this whole transition of recovery in regard to obsessive thinking isn't about, like Arla said the other day. if you remember 2 or 3 weeks ago. He said, well, we're not supposed to not think and not feel, right?
Mm-hmm.
My sense is we've been thinking obsessively so long that we think that's all thinking is. It's just obsessive thinking. So when we think about not thinking obsessively, we immediately think what we're being told is not to think and not to feel. Isn't that interesting that that's what we've been trying to do in the obsessive thinking? And when anybody suggests we stop thinking obsessively, which is trying not to actually think because it's thoughtlessness and numbness, we're trying to desensitize ourselves to the actual experience we're having by claiming the experience we're having is only what we think it is, and taking the vastness of something infinite and reducing it down to a single thought that is corrupting all my other thoughts about my thinking is reality. So if I'm getting better and starting to see the dullness, it's clearly an indication that I'm aware of what's happening accurately. And it isn't inspiring because I'm now aware sensitively of the inspiration. I'm aware of it because I've experienced it. And the application of the conversation with others is where that really shows up. I can think about it all the time. If I don't apply it, I don't get the absolute confirmation that other people of all types absolutely know this too. And you see it in Alcoholics Anonymous, you see it in Narcotics Anonymous, you see it in Al Anon, you see it in all the different programs. And I would say people see it all the time. They just don't think they see it because they're busy maintaining those thoughts. I would just bring that back to me whenever I'm maintaining a thought that's not real and I think it's real. And I suspect I still have plenty of those thoughts circulating in my system because there's times I feel reactive and defensive and have opinions about others that aren't kind. And when I start thinking about how stupid somebody else is, I begin to realize I'm really beginning to admit the stupidity of my own thinking. It has nothing to do with them. I've been using people as an excuse to simply avoid admitting the things I'm actually doing in my own experience.
Yeah,
But for
these.
you,
Yeah.
in this, you know how everybody's saying, well, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? Michael, I think, got a little upset last 2 weeks ago. You know, I want an answer. I want to fix it. I want to get out of this cycle. And the fact is, the awareness of the cycle is the beginning of coming to terms with it accurately. So the idea of having to do it all the time goes away because the reference point now is becoming clear about what's actually happening. And when I started looking at what was happening, I was very, very upset about the fact that there is very little being done in general within the population that's getting much better, as far as I can tell. We seem to be repeating this sort of reactive thing, thinking we're going to come up with a new brainstorm, a new form of solution that's like the electric car movement. Nobody's thinking about the batteries. I mean, they are. There's nothing they know that they can deal with them. They're going to be toxic in the system somehow or another. But this is seen as a huge wave against carbon and all that kind of stuff. And that works. I get it. But it really isn't bulletproof and it really isn't a solution. It's just a new problem with the new face doing something a little differently and giving us the impression temporarily that we've really come up with it now. So I happen to like the idea. The consequences of it, though, tell me that it's once again, if we can kick it down the road a little bit, we don't seem to want to actually face what we're doing now. Our universe is built on energy, electromagnetic energy. It's everywhere. And we haven't figured out how to utilize it freely and pollution free. So everything we do commercially tends to create some kind of a byproduct that really isn't aligned with nature. It's simply aligned with the thinking we do about what we can and can't do and what we should or shouldn't do relative to the limited thinking that we're doing as a species.
Right. No, I get that.
So the other side of it is that this doesn't remove depression. I mean, I'm upset about things that I see for the first time in my life. I actually notice that I'm visibly moved and shaken, stirred and shaken, like James
Martine.
Bond's
Yeah.
Martini, that it literally stirs me. And sometimes it's very upsetting. And what's upsetting, I realize, is that my own limited influence, I've been so uninfluential. I've had so little to give for so long that I haven't taken the steps that might otherwise illuminate others to the point where we can start talking about this more openly and more accurately and watch the solutions just simply appear. because they haven't been hidden. We've just been operating in that blind mental understanding that's actually misunderstanding. That seeming blindness that I don't know that I'm not doing what I'm doing, I'm not thinking what I'm thinking because all I'm thinking is what's right. My thinking is reality, and all I'm going to see as a result of is everything as I want to see it, think I need to see it to support that contention. But if the contention is wrong, all I'm seeing everything as is wrong, thinking it's real. That's a major conflict and a major diminishment of our capacity as beings to express inspiration and intuition and that power, that grace of knowing that we know and we're aware. We wouldn't hurt and suffer if we weren't.
But so just going back to the dinner party, do you talk about this at every instance of a gathering of more than two people?
Yes, I amongst the crowd closest to me, everybody say you're obsessed with the obsession.
Yeah.
And I do, and one of the points that I make is that I don't see anything more fundamental to discuss. I don't see all the little chit chat as very meaningful
Yeah,
because I
that's
think
what I
so much of it is just about, well, I did this and they did that, and isn't it cute? And all this kind of stuff to me is a chance to try and escape, like with these little flurries, these little salvos of, you know, throwing a rocket up into space and watching it, but it's coming down. You think you're getting away and it's landing at some point. And I don't diminish in every respect that people are having their own experience, but I see it as a diminished capacity to make believe that the greatest thing we can do is simply serve the immediacy of our family and think that everybody else can go to hell and we'll be fine. And for the most part, that's what most of that conversation is about. And I understand that. I understand responsibility as a father and as a husband and all that kind of stuff. And I love my family. But to think of them as the sole purpose of my life would be to put them in harm's way against everyone else who I'm not bothering to even consider.
huh.
And that broader view is not too hard to see when you start looking accurate. When I started looking accurately at it, I started realizing how that's been the root of war from the beginning. Families, tribes getting together, thinking they were better than the other ones. If they had the advantage, they were going to take everything from the other one and kill them all, rather than say, wait, collectively, we may be able to perform functions well beyond the idea that continuing to maintain this sort of vengeful, spiteful, hateful approach to dominating people were really, those are really, in my estimation, exercises in trying to dominate the thinking that we're doing and claim dominion over the internal conflict that we've created by making believe dominating other people proves we're right. And it's the same thing as all the other it's the same kind of thing that an addiction would do. Feel better about something that's wrong by doing more of it all the time, chronically, 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 drinking, 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 cocaine, 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 smoking cigarettes, whatever it is that is the addiction. And I don't suspect all of those things. I think people can drink and not drink. I think people can do coke and not do coke. But if there's a addictive element to it, the thinking becomes that coke is the problem and I can't stop it. When in fact, when I'm constantly trying to stop it, I'm again dealing with the effect of it rather than looking at the cause and saying, wait a minute, I'm the one causing that. I'm the one starting it every time. It's not that I can't stop it. I just consistently think that restarting it is somehow going to work and solve the problem. That's where my problem lies, not in the stopping. So where is that between us thinking? It's in the present. If the present is an absolute state of being, and the idea that we're not in the present because we're thinking about something else or we're distracted, think about that. We would have to give thinking credit as being reality, which is exactly what we've done. And once again, wherever we are thinking we're not present because we're thinking about something else, we're simply present thinking we're not present. Where's the problem in that? Not with the presence, but the thinking. Just like it's not with reality that the problem exists, it's with the thinking about reality that the problem exists, or the thinking about life that the problem exists. People say, well, that's just life. Life presents all these problems. No, it's what I'm making of those challenges or opportunities to grow. That's the problem. If I'm actually using it as a guidance system and saying, wow, I'm getting accurate information all the time. And I used to even think when my feelings said something's wrong, that I was wrong rather than what I was thinking was wrong. That's a good example of how I've assimilated thinking as being my reality when it isn't. It's just something I do and something that certainly manifests effects that can be extremely compelling. And the more they hurt, the more they seem real, the more they seem out of my control, because it seems like something I don't want, when in fact I'm creating that pain to get my attention, which is why pain is a touchstone of spiritual growth. Why would I wait so long for it to hurt so much to finally admit it if I wasn't denying the subtlety of it in the beginning? I wouldn't have to wait if I was actually paying attention to what was actually happening rather than thinking of it as something that's not happening and finally face it when it gets to a point that it's absolutely unbearable.
So I'm the only nut bar sitting at that table.
I think the other side of it, though, Gabe, is to start really noticing that everyone, notice all the ideas you have about them are also reflections of the ideas you have about that self you claim to be you.
Yeah.
And for me, it's kind of a chance to, and I don't tend to hang out in those things very quickly or easily or readily. I don't like large groups and all that kind of stuff that are formal like that. I like to deal with where I can actually be with somebody in a situation where I can talk to them. But even in those groups, I tend to peel one or two people off so that I can focus on that conversation. Because for me, my experience, again, not something anybody has to do or think, but it's in the application of the discussion that the confirmation of it starts to become obvious. And part of what became obvious for me, and we've witnessed it in the mental discussion that we have, the mental obsession discussion we have, is the reactivity is often very difficult to deal with. People get angry. They get very reactive. They don't want to be interrupted when they're telling their story.
Oh God, yeah. But even when the story is just about what their kid did Tuesday or whatever it is, this one person was really adamant that she finish all her stories, and they ended up with no point or
Right.
no
Hey,
destination.
guys.
Hey,
Is that Anthony?
yeah. Oh, and Jackie's here too.
Hey, Jack.
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, I wasn't looking for a minute. Gabe and I have been talking basically about, well, Gabe, I'll let you describe it so you get a little practice.
Oh boy, what were we talking about? No, we had a dinner party last night, and I found it very hard to be in conversation that is not about substantial subjects like our discussions have been. Um, and Jack, these were very intelligent, highly educated people, and we're talking about the most banal things. And it's hard for me to sit in there and not try and make a snide joke or trying to ruffle up some feathers because it just gets so boring to me. And we're talking about my perception of those other people and um, how are they or they may or may not be, addicts in another way themselves or obsession about their own perception of themselves, as it were, the self that's not there. And but we were just talking about stories, and everyone really likes to finish their story. And
That's the obsession.
yeah, this one
The
person in specific was really about got to finish the story about nothing.
Well,
Nothing.
that's why I try to interrupt people when I know they're doing that, and it's you can see the reactiveness. I mean, people get really angry. I mean, I've had people that don't talk to me anymore, but I would rather that be the case. And I don't think that it's imperative. I just, in my own frustration, which is obviously not the highest capacity I have to be frustrated by my own lack of participation to the degree that I feel I need to reveal this thing that's going on. But I also am not sure there's any other way to do it, and that to listen uninterrupted is also to reinforce that that story is somehow going to get better the more they tell it and give them the comfort that they're looking for. And I would say if I'm doing that by being quiet, I'd rather be the one that's antagonistic and not liked and all that. So I can at least be there at some point where they may be interested in talking about it and be seen as a pariah at some point and then potentially valuable at some other point and have them see that I haven't run and I haven't dissuaded them from participating in the conversation. I've been available as much as I can be when I am. And I find in sobriety, that's a lot of, that's the love that shows up even after somebody is told to do something they don't think they should do, and they find out the benefits from it are enormous and begin to realize, wow, I have a propensity to avoid and deny and resist good information that people are offering me. And I don't want to act on it at all. And it sort of opens that window. My sense is the chance is to confront it. And part of the way to do that, my experience too, is to not engage in the stories at all. Because generally along the way, people are saying, uh-huh, do you see what I mean? Do you know what I mean? 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 Begging for some support in that process. So if they're reactive, you're actually helping them develop the story to engage in it. And I would say that's gone on long enough. I would say historically, if it's gone on since the beginning of people able to speak and think, it may well be worth not participating in the way that we think we have to because of these social um, issues, and just basically begin to neutralize it by being, it's like multiplying the biggest infinity by zero. It still ends up zero. I mean, actually, in infinity, it probably doesn't because it's not affected by mass, but in any other number, it would.
Yeah.
The bigger thing, too, with that, Gabe, is that this conversation, which I think we're growing in, and I would suggest to you that your awareness to even see those things and notice them in the way that actually gives you curiosity about what to do with them is actually growth. And it's very interesting that we can think of growth as only getting better at our reactivity and developing new ways of trying to put ourselves, numb ourselves, and desensitize ourselves to the problem and think that that's growth, trying to feel better about something wrong. And yet, when we're actually getting better at feeling the wrong, which is ultimately the goal of sensitization and sensation, the sensational aspect of our absolute awareness is to actually know what's wrong. And what would wrong be but something that simply doesn't work within reality? It doesn't have any place because it's simply a thought masquerading. If I can have a wrong thought and it's not a problem because I can say, oh, it's wrong. I don't have to continue with that at all. It's only when I think it's right it's only when I think my insanity is sane that that whole collision of addiction, the thinking begins to actually seem as though it's something I can't stop because it's not something I'm admitting I'm starting. I've actually taken the position that I'm not even doing it because within the thinking, it would be insane to admit that I'm thinking I'm sane about insanity. So what do? Go blind within my understanding. And it's really misunderstanding that I'm now interpreting as being my understanding. So to see those things and become aware of those things is to actually notice that you're very much aware of them. You just haven't been spending a lot of time paying attention to that awareness. And it's always been there in full bloom because it's never minimized, it's never changed, it's never more or less. It's an absolute state of being in the present. That is grace. That is the power. That is the absolute nature of our existence. And so too, all existence.
Hmm.
So if we're talking about it here, and yet we're still talking about the stories of the week, we're missing the chance just to begin to actually notice that to begin to consider that is to actually begin to realize that the problems we seem to face that seem so difficult are no more than the limits of the thinking that we're doing about them. Because in that absolute reality, there aren't any problems. There is no disease there. There is no insanity there. There is no, and where is there? Here, now. that doesn't exist except to the limitations of our thinking. So if we're thinking that way as a species and just start thinking about the species, we can certainly talk about everyone without talking about anyone in any derogatory term. Start talking about everyone in honest terms and recognize that if we're doing this collectively, there's a lot of people suffering that may be better off with other people who aren't suffering quite as much. And start to actually see that those paradigm shifts are paradigm shifts because people start seeing something that's always been true and finally just concede it, and notice how simple things get when they do. Just like when Copernicus said, we're not at the center of the universe. That's why we have all these wacky maps of how the orbits of the planets and the moons and the suns and the stars and all that stuff are going. They're all wrong. So what did we do? Threaten to kill him if he kept talking about it. That reactivity has been going on through history, and we've been managing it, trying to maintain it, thinking someday it'll get better. It has not gotten better. We are at a point now where we have more weapons on this planet than it would take to annihilate the entire species. There isn't a species on Earth or anywhere near Earth that we know of that has that capacity. And it certainly isn't being used while it was claimed originally to be for peaceful means. What has it turned into? It's crazy. So if I think I'm a part or I'm better because I've got my family in order, or I've got the immediacy of the people around me agreeing with me, I'm not better. I'm basically once again promoting the idea that what I need is everybody to agree so that I can feel like if I need everybody else, I'm not noticing that I already have everybody else. I'm already with everybody else. I'm already a part of everyone else. And what we all share is not something we need to agree with at all, because truth does not need to be agreed with or believed in or had faith in to be true. It was true before our species even got here. Why would it not be true now, even when we think it isn't? So the ultimate practice is actually beginning to consider those things and saying, wow, that means it's not impossible for everybody to make a mental shift and actually see that addiction, while we call it addiction, has basically just been a commitment to maintaining things that aren't true as true, and that conflict is impossible to ever overcome as long as it's maintained. The maintenance isn't in reality. The problem isn't with reality. It isn't with spirituality. It isn't with an absolute, truthful, honest, present nature. It's with the thinking about those things. Nothing more. So now it's simple rather than much more complicated. And well, nobody's ever going to believe that. And I can't get through to people because I try to get through to them rather than see they've already got it. So as I've learned that and been more cognizant of that, I feel a little less insistent in the conversation I have. And historically, and a lot of the conversations we've had, I think I've been very insistent in people listening and getting and understanding it, which is a weakness of my own awareness of that absolute state of being. Those are my thoughts that are weak and corrupted and somewhat vulnerable to that. Not even somewhat, absolutely vulnerable and weak because they have no basis. I'm aiming in a direction that I think is right, but I'm doing it in a way that suggests I'm not quite sure. So, but I've held on to these thoughts for so many years that when I finally started talking about it, I thought, man, I'd rather be wrong about talking about this than continue to live in that silent state of feeling wrong all the time and wondering why I didn't fit. So
Yeah.
the growth comes from you and Jackie and Anthony and all the other voices that are starting to go, oh, ah, mm, all that little bit of awareness is we already know. We already know we know, and we're aware we're aware. Awareness ultimately is inspiration because it is the root. Grace is the power. It is this absolute gift that is uninterrupted. The guy last night at the convention said, he said you can take a teaspoon of it, you can take a bucket of it, it's all up to you. You can also dive into it. And my contention would be we can't dive out of it. because it's not something that functions on the basis of relative terms. It's not a here or there or a more or less. It's an absolute state of being that isn't any of those things because it doesn't even exist in time and space. And yet, time and space exist in it, within the confines of it, as an idea, as a concept, as a conscious awareness of possibilities. Mamma mia.
No, it's
Hmm?
yeah, like you said, we're still talking about our weekly or daily experiences and not the larger knowingness.
Well, and interesting too, Gabe, something I learned early in this, which is why I let the silence prevail at times, is that that present state of awareness is completely silent and still because Bill says it's a simple program. Why? Because it's based on principles and based on absolutes. Why are they simple? Because they do not change. They don't change because I don't think of them correctly. They stay the same. And what changes is my experience of the difficulties I face trying to have them seem to be what I think of them rather than what they are. And rather than align with what they are, I function on the basis of malign thoughts to the degree that I think defensiveness and reactiveness is the goal to maintain something. So I can basically maintain my own righteousness, which is never right in my experience. Whenever I feel righteous, I know I'm wrong because I wouldn't feel it if I was right. I would feel free. I would feel peace. I would feel inclusion. I would feel accepting. I would feel admitting someone into that sphere rather than think of them as separate from it and caustic and toxic and all those other thoughts when I'm really just revealing my own experience of what I'm doing and thinking of it as something. Again, if I'm thinking my insanity is sane, I'm going to think the toxic thoughts I'm having are being caused by somebody else and that they are toxic, not me. They're toxic. I can't hang with them. Interesting that I would think about not doing with them exactly what I'm doing and not notice how difficult it is to live in my own experience with that toxicity. So
Yeah,
that silence, and
that's how other people think, is like I can't be with them.
yeah,
They're toxic.
because if it's indivisible, just look for the divisibility. Look for the conflicts. If something's indivisible, the reason is there's no parts and pieces. It's a seamless reality that does not change. So there are no parts and pieces to conflict. But if you're seeing it in them, you're doing it to see it. And the absence of it is the healing of it, is the giving them, is the forgiving of that healing. That's literally what forgiveness is. It isn't about what that person did, it's what we're doing in relation to them that we forgive. We're correcting that by talking to them, by making an amends and saying, look, I've had it wrong. I thought of it as you, and in fact, it was sourced in me, in my, not in me as a being, but in my thinking, in my action. And cleaning that up gives us that sense of that person in a much different way. One of the guys that spoke at the meeting talked about having been abused by his uncle. You know the
Hmm.
Wayne, sexually abused, and the uncle ended up in prison. And one of the things his sponsor told him to do was to visit him. He went to see him once, thinking he was going to get an apology, and his sponsor said, "You know what?" And when he left, he made amends to his uncle. And his uncle's, he said at the end, "Is there anything I can do?" And he said, "Well, you could visit me." And he thought to himself, "Well, that's not going to happen." And he said, "I don't have any money. You could put some money in my account here. And if you come again, you could bring me a couple packs of cigarettes." And the sponsor said, "All right, you go every month, bring him 2 cartons of cigarettes, and put money in his account every month."
Oh my God.
So he did. For 5 years, he went, just took the direction. Again, took the direction contrary to what he thought was right because he was on a vengeful crusade to fix somebody else, sort somebody else out. I got to change my my headset battery. Hang tight. I'm going to turn one off and get the other one on. All right. You there?
Yeah, got me.
So 5 years goes by. The uncle never apologizes for anything. And at some point, he decides he's going to move to California and goes to tell him he can't visit anymore. And the sponsor said, you can still give money, you can still send him stuff. So he agreed he would continue to do that. And as he was walking out that last time, the uncle said, come here for a minute. And he completely apologized. The last minute, the last hope he had, rather than the first time he went to justify the trip he made, he spent all those years doing what he could do to forgive and learn about forgiveness and learn about the fact that it's what we're doing. When something has stopped that somebody did, it's no longer what they did that we're struggling with, but what we think about it that we're struggling with. And we offer them no potential for redemption by fighting them. Well, I wouldn't say that. We offer them much less potential for redemption by fighting them rather than actually beginning to be responsible for our job. That's the forgiving. What am I giving? A sense of being, a sense of place, a sense of acknowledgement that what's happened has happened and it's over. And if it's over and I'm continuing to resent it, to hate somebody over it, to have spite for somebody over it, that's what I am doing with it. Now I am the cause of that problem. I am doing what they did when they thought they were right for me to be doing it and think that I have nothing else to do but that.
That's why you've been married 3 times.
Definitely. Well, I am very close with my second wife, thankfully, and so is Katie, which I really appreciate a lot. The two of them to get together really well. They actually just spent some time together recently.
Well, that speaks
And
to Katie too. I mean, that's
absolutely, absolutely. Well, and my second wife, Elizabeth, is a brilliant, absolutely brilliant woman. And you were talking earlier about the people around your table as being
yeah,
really intelligent.
yeah.
Who better than people who are intelligent to create a scenario where they have created a maze and then also created the idea that they have no way how to get out, that they don't know how to get out. They're the creators of it, actually pretending they have no way to get out. And that's what we've been doing as a species. Now, that's a high level of intellect to be able to do that. That is not stupidity. That's actually brilliance and genius, and shows that if we can do that in a derogatory direction, what happens when we actually start to take those bonds apart and start to have that fall apart and operate in a direction where we're actually complementing one another's ability to be productive and useful and gainful and whole? What happens? I would say things will happen that certainly we can't even make believe will happen right now, because before we even believe in them, we'll see them happening. And if you notice, a lot of people will see something they've actually witnessed and say, that's unbelievable. We don't even have belief in things that we witness happening. Well, we have belief in things that we can't even make happen. That's insanity. It's backward. So intuition is knowledge beyond reason. It's an awareness that we all have. It's an awareness that we all share. It isn't divided by any of our inabilities within our thinking because it isn't divisible. We all have it in the exact same amount because it's not an amount, it's in an absolute present state of being. It's not in quantities. It's not in the sort of things that we seem to struggle with within the ideas of scarcity and abundance. It's just a state of being. It's a place. It's an ever present place that is no place because it isn't here and now except to human bodies that think in those terms. It's an ever present state that was ever present before bodies thought in those terms
Hmm.
because it isn't in time. It's not in time. It's in an essence that is completely devoid of time and space. And that's our present state. How could it be infinite and we could be exceptions to it? Isn't that the greatest grandiose idea ever conceived? And that's why ego is thought to be so demonic and so so hell-bent and so twisted and so, we treat it like it's this flagrant part of us that just gets a little out of hand every once in a while, but it's literally the totality of every thought we maintain that isn't true as truth, including that self that you mentioned earlier that we think we have because we can think of our thinking itself and just conclude that because we're thinking of thinking itself, that must be the self that we are. And we start having a debate, this internal debate with two of us, constantly trying to argue that thing into submission. And apparently it hasn't worked if resolutions are still being, repeated popularly every year on New Year's, as though a date's going to change everything, when the whole year has proven that we're not interested in changing it.
Yeah, that's funny. The internal, the two.
Yeah. Well, if we say we're talking to ourselves or thinking about ourselves, we're really talking to our thoughts. And the simplicity of this conversation is to see that if you begin to simply assign what's happening, largely what's happening that you feel is difficult, simply to your thinking, and saying, oh, I'm thinking difficult things. When I'm experiencing difficulty, when I'm experiencing demoralization, when I'm experiencing instability, begin to notice my thoughts are unstable. They're immoral because they have nothing to do with reality, and I'm acting as though they do. And they're depressing because the weight, I can't bear the weight. I'm not designed to bear the weight because I'm in a weightless absolute existence because there is no weight in that knowingness. So any added weight becomes very, very apparent, and it becomes impulses, impressions that we create become depressing in time because we consistently refuse them, fight them, and our body eventually absorbs the anxiety and the stress and starts to get tense. And what happens? Things don't go well with our bodies. Our health doesn't feel very good. We don't feel well, literally. We're not feeling well enough to feel what we're feeling, and we end up not feeling well in our body. If you think about the words not feeling well, I'm not sensitive to what's happening very well. Looking at them accurately rather than just simply a feeling I'm trying to get over again or a thought I'm trying to get over by trying to feel better about it. Maintaining what's worse isn't the solution. It's noticing that what's worse has nothing to do with anything other than my resistance to admitting I have something to do with it, but I'm causing it. We will intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. What baffled me was that I kept using the same thinking over and over again in seemingly new ways because it was different. And then I realized my thinking's always changing. Of course, it's different. That doesn't make what I'm doing new. It makes the same tree that I'm eating the rotten apples off of rotten. And the difference between intuition is it's not in thinking, it's in knowing. It's not about thinking, it's not about reason, it's not about understanding. And when I understand that, then I start living up to the end of the 12 step and the 12 and 12. Bill says understanding is the key. Understanding is the key to right principles and attitudes. And right action, following right principles and attitudes, right action is the key to good living. It's not wrong action. It's not any action. It's not stuff that's dysfunctional. It's actually doing it right. What's right? Aligning with what's happening. That's reality, not what's wrong. That's completely disconnected to reality because it has no place other than my thinking. That sense of displacement you were describing is accurately assessing that displacement because you've given reality to a thought. That thought has no place. What do you feel? You have no place because you think, by nature of thinking your thoughts are real, that you are only what you think. And as a result, whatever you think must be who you are and how you are. So you feel displaced, disconnected, depressed, alone, lonely, isolated. What could be more isolated than a thought that has absolutely no basis in reality? It doesn't even exist except for the time we spend giving it attention. And even then, still has no basis. Our attention is being wasted, and we know it. time spent focusing on things that aren't happening in the name of wondering why we're not dealing very well with what is happening. And I would say attention deficit disorder is largely, if not exclusively, based on that effort and that consistent, chronic reliance that has proven that not paying attention to what's happening is not very fruitful, not very productive, not very satisfying, not very thoughtful, not fulfilling. And what do people feel? Empty, alone, disgusted, incomprehensibly demoralized. Of course, acting morally would do that.
Alrighty.
Hmm?
Alrighty.
So during the week, just contemplate these things. Anyone listening, this isn't a telling of the truth. Truth need be told nothing because it speaks for itself in the present nature of your awareness, right now, always. It's always there. The fulfillment of it is always there. What you think of it is why you think it isn't. That's all. But if you consider some of this, as preposterous as it may seem, just consider it, live with it. We have no obligation to choose what we think because we're free to think what we want. We have no obligation to make decisions about what we think and conclude all of a sudden that we need to come to a conclusion really quick so we can settle and get on with it if most of our conclusions are wrong. And I would suggest any conclusion made in advance of having all the information, which would be infinite, an absolute knowing awareness, is always going to come up with shortfalls and thoughts. Doesn't mean you can't make decisions, but to think of them as absolutely right and completely unchangeable is to think of them once again incorrectly because they're always the potential to change a choice is always available or it wouldn't be a choice. Even the potential not to choose is always available or it wouldn't be a choice. So we're free to think what we want. And if we're thinking what's causing the problem, we can always rethink. And to include in that this idea that there is this concept, because to thinking it is a concept, to reality there's nothing else, to begin to notice that there's an absolute state of being that we are naturally part of. If nature is natural, then our nature is nature and natural. It isn't some concoction of a ritual that we need to stand on our head and do on a regular basis to get to. It's where we are. All the getting to that we've been trying has given us the impression that we're further from it for us to still be looking through history to find it. It's not a coincidence or an accident that we think those things. It's completely aligned with exactly what we're thinking about it now is somewhere else, someplace else, something to get, something to go to, something to find, something to seek, something to journey, something to have a path for. The present nature requires none of that whatsoever. And if you consider that, it will challenge thoughts that are filled with fear. And to feel that fear is to begin to dismantle those thoughts because the dissolution of them will literally dissolve them. Dissolving is very different than resolving, where you're constantly trying to come up with a new solution. Dissolving means it's like fog in the morning. When the sun comes up, the fog just vanishes seemingly miraculously. And all it really does is reveal that it was just a foggy notion in the sky, waiting for a little heat, a little warmth, a little enlightenment to look at it honestly, to begin to actually dissipate. Those obstacles are no more obstacles than we insist on making them to give us the justification to continue doing the one thing what we know we should never do. Just like if you're an alcoholic, the last thing you should do is drink. It's not the last thing, it's the thing to never do. But embracing the fact that you can always do it is the beginning of having the freedom to see exactly where you will go if you do it. It's the same with the thinking. When I begin to see I'm actually doing it and I admit it and I concede it and I know it because I already know it, all of a sudden it makes no sense to continue. Not because I've done anything miraculous, but because I'm witnessing the grace and the power that actually has never seen it in me or of me anyhow. And that nature is my nature because it's our nature. It's the nature of nature. Everything, every grain of sand has this connection. And everything between all things is the essence of that knowing awareness. We are in it, we're of it, we are not the creators of it. We do not need to think of it in those terms to be able to express it in all ways, in all things, ever presently, how we are, where we are, as we are. So ponder, live with it. Don't need to conclude it. There's nothing to conclude with something that's already perfectly conclusive without having to be concluded at all. And as you do, you may see that there are some things that happen that can also be disturbing. But like Gabe and I talked about, when you start looking at disturbing things and seeing them as disturbing, you're actually aligning your awareness with what's happening. There are plenty of disturbing things in the world to look at that are disturbing, that aren't pretending to be seeing it in someone else when it's what we're trying to avoid that we're doing in our own experience that's creating the conflict and the seeming impossibility to convince them they have to do it because it's bothering us, rather than seeing that the bother in us is coming from the thinking we're doing about them. Love you guys. Good to see your name, Jackie.
Thanks, Jack.
You got it.
Bye,
We'll
guys.
continue. Bye.